But when I say normative, I mean ethical and political theories regarding how we should treat them. But the general framework of the conference led people to believe that you can actually be neutral, be non-political in a conference on animal studies. No doubt the organizers sincerely believed that they could avoid make normative statements about our relationship with other animals. So the problem is not so much that they did not have many paper dealings with ethical and political issues. After all, it's a conference devoted to the humanities in general and not only to activists or ethicists. So this is all right. But the problem is that they were completely blind to the fact that they cannot but make normative statements. When it comes to animals, these ideological commitments may be less visible. They can be almost invisible because they are in line with the dominant ideology. But implicitly, the conference organizers were making the unarticulated claim that it is just okay, it is just fine to breed and kill animals because they serve chicken, cheese, and cow milk. I felt as if we had a feminist conference in a strip club or something like that. So not only did they offer product coming from the exploitation, the suffering and the murder. By murder, I mean intentional and unnecessary killing of innocent sentient individuals. But they did not offer any other alternative with the coffee and only cheese on the first night. Okay, the second night after I complained, they served tofu with the chicken. So, of course, it's just that they did not think about it. But the problem is that they should have. We were in a conference on animal studies on the renewed interest for the animals in the humanities. If people who are concerned about animals don't think about these things, if people who organize those kind of conferences on post-humanism and stuff like that don't talk about these things, no one will and nothing will ever change. So given the major economic interest vested in animal exploitation, we should not and we cannot miss any opportunity to speak on behalf of animals. We must create more opportunity. Organize more conferences, publish more books, write more articles, do more interview, organize larger and louder protests, stuff like that. And this brings me to my main point. I would like you to think about organizing the next student for critical animal studies in your college or university. If not this year, then the next. We need to make sure that the revolution in animal studies, which is happening right now in the universities, where we can study other animals and our relationship with them in sociology department, history, geography, law, political science, philosophy. Like, I forget a lot of those, of other things. But we need to make sure that all this academic work on other animals doesn't forget that we are talking about living, breathing, and feeling creatures. We are slaughtering... Sorry. Oh, yes, no, sorry. This is in French, but you know what that means, the Genesis part. So we are slaughtering more than 60 billion domesticated animals per year, excluding the animal we hunt and fish. We shed more blood of domesticated animals every year than there were human beings killed in all the wars in human history. In fact, as my friend Frédéric Côté-Boudreau counted, it takes only 2 days and a half. That is the length of our conference, 2 days and a half to kill as many domesticated animals, cows, sheep, chickens, that we killed humans in all the war in history, which would be around 400 to 500 million. My number is a bit higher than yours. So since the 1960s, the human population doubled and the population of wild animals diminished by a third in 50 years. Many scientists are talking about the sixth great extinction crisis in the history of our planet. The ecological crisis, climate change, rainforest destruction, desertification, water and air pollution, resource scarcity are all interconnected problems, and at the middle of them all, we find animal farming. Farming is a prime contributor of all these massive problems. Oh, sorry. Have you seen this picture before? It's a satellite picture of the feedlot in Texas. Here, have a closer look. This is from closer, and from satellite, and again further. This is not blood, it's algae. there are some other picture with green algae. But when we are focusing on the massive scale of contemporary animal farming, we distract ourselves. We need to stop focusing on minor fixes to the system and stop farming animals to slaughter them altogether. Sorry for the next image. Some of you might want to close your eyes. Even when they come from smaller farms, they are killed in the same slaughterhouses when they are really young, almost babies. Here's a graph. The red line is showing the age we slaughter them, and the gray line, their average life expectancy. So the moral principle is simple, according to me. We should not intentionally harm others, other individuals, other sentient animals when we can avoid it. So the principle is simple, but the consequences of these very simple principles are really huge. We could have a chance to tackle climate change, stop deforestation, start planting trees again, give their land back to wild animals. Stop farming animals would also mean to have plenty of nutritious food and healthy food for every human being and enough clean water for them. The UN predict that by 2050, 1 billion people will not have access to clean water if we don't cut the meat production by half. But it is expected to double by that time in 2050. So we are wondering how we will be able to feed 9 billion human beings in 1950, but we will be feeding almost 150 billion domesticated animals at that time. So when we are fighting for justice for other animals, we need to make clear in our minds and in our actions that we are not only fighting about other animals, but also about human animals, about social and environmental justice. And this brings us to one of the principles of critical animal studies. Animal activists and scholars need to avoid single-issue campaign in favor of alliance politics and solidarity with other struggles against oppression, hierarchy, and exploitation. We need to understand that we won't ameliorate the plight of other animals, whether domesticated or wild, without ameliorating the fate of other humans. But the opposite is also true. The radical and progressist thinkers need to realize that they won't succeed in bringing about human liberation without animal liberation. The material and the ideological conditions which enable the enslavement, the torture, and the massive non-criminal killing of animals are basically the same condition which enable the oppression of marginalized human beings, whether they are women, people with disabilities, people considered less civilized or more primitive. When we animalize other individuals to justify their oppression, we are doing two distinct things. First, we depersonalize them. That means we prevent them from appearing as vulnerable selves with a biographical life of their own, which matters to them as much as our life matters to us. And secondly, we make them appear as inferior or lower on a hierarchical and therefore as exist on a hierarchical scale, and therefore as existing for our own benefit, for the benefit of the higher ones. Women exist for men, black people for whites, animals for human beings. It's the same strategy that gets repeated over and over in human history. So by defending our strong duties not to harm any animals, or the basic negative rights to sentient individuals, we don't only prevent the abuse of other animals, but of other vulnerable and marginalized human beings who can easily be animalized, depersonalized, and appear construed as inferior. So we need to oppose not only the oppression of some, but the oppression of all, no matter how different and how strange they may be, no matter how insignificant their life may look to us. We are pretty bad at seeing the value in others' life, particularly when they live a life very different from our own. And this is especially true when we benefit from their death. No matter how insignificant the life of some people and some animals may look like from an outside perspective, As soon as we are able to recognize that we are dealing with another self, this imposes on us strong duty not to harm, enslave, or kill this individual. This point has been made in the animal rights movement by Tom Regan, Gary Francione, and recently by Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicka, who seek to extend the basic protection to all sentient individuals, to animals with a conscious life like ours. So I just really briefly distinguish between two kinds of approach inside the abolitionist, or inside the animal rights movement, or inside the animal liberation movement. What I call the extensionist approach and the radical or critical approach. The extensionist approach is sometimes called humanist because it seeks to extend existing principle of justice and equality to other animals. And the critical or radical approach claims that it is not enough to bring animals in our existing normative framework, but we need to radically rethink our ethical and political theories, our ways of living and thinking. Wow, my God, I still have 2 pages, so I'll just forget about my text. So the extensionist approach reject what I call human supremacy, but they accept human exceptionalism. So they don't accept the idea that humans can do whatever they want with animals, and they do that through the distinction between moral agent and moral patient. But they accept you can say human exceptionalism, because they say only human beings as rational animals can have duties toward animals. And when you go more on the critical or radical approaches, they reject both human exceptionalism and human supremacy. And they challenge the rationalist conception of moral and political agency, and they make animals appear as moral and political agents. And so it's really two different frameworks, but all within the animal liberation or animal rights movement. Those two kind of approach still rely on the same 2 basic principles, and I'll just conclude on those. The first one, okay, these are, maybe you won't agree with them. If you don't, just come see me, we'll have a fight. You know? So the first principle, according to me, which is that the fundamental basic principles for all those 2 different ways of approaching animal liberation, is that first, human beings are not the only conscious individuals on the planet. There are many other animals with a psychological, emotional, and social life who seem to have a subjective experience of their environing world and their shared world. It's important here to understand that when we are talking about consciousness, we are not talking about thematic higher order reflection. I'm not saying that the animals stop what they are doing and realize that they are in pain or that they are grieving. I'm talking about consciousness understood as being able to experience emotion, moods, affective states, and a variety of lived experiences. Feeling, exactly. Consciousness as feelings. So the second principle claims that we have duties to care and duties to respect, so duties of compassion and duties of justice toward others, not because they are rational beings, but because they are vulnerable selves, individuals for whom things matters. People who want to reject animal rights theories need either deny one and claim no, other animals are not sentient beings, they are not conscious, or to deny the second claim, that what matters morally is not sentience, vulnerability, or agency, but rationality, language, or some other qualification that will not only exclude other animals or marginalize humans, but in fact, each of us at different time of our lives when we are most in need of those basic protections. So, and also this, as Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicka insist, this would mean to reject many of the advances in human rights that people have been advocating since the 1960s. So we need to recognize that no matter how insignificant the life of some people or some animal may look like from an outside perspective, as soon as we recognize another self, this imposes on us strong duties not to harm, enslave, or kill. I'm talking about duties, but you can also think about basic negative rights, which is the same thing. So our duties not to harm can be construed as right to life, to liberty, and to bodily integrity, whichever languages you prefer. Some criticize the attempt to export liberal theories and advocate for different ways of bringing about a post-abolitionist world. Some criticize the idea of even thinking that there could be domesticated animals once we abolish the property status of animals, on the ground that it's simply impossible to think about just relationship with other animals. But this is precisely what we need to discuss. What could a post-abolitionist world look like? What do we want it to look like? And how can we make this happen? So I hope some of you have thoughts about it, because I would like to hear it. As I explained last night, we will have a protest tonight. And if people want to think about insight from the conference or principles, or Marion, can you come talk about the protest a bit? Because Liliana, can you come too? Yeah. They are organizing the protest, so I'll leave them say more about this.
I don't want to take up too much time. Hello everyone, my name is Marion. Yes, so the goal is to bring liberation theory into the streets, to really keep the connection strong between activists on the ground and academic activists. So we're inviting you to come to, Square Phillips. It's 10 minutes on foot from here. Does everyone know where it is? It's really not far. It's on St. Catherine between Union, I think, and Alimer.
It's in front of the bay, you know, the bay store, right there.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So it's easy to find. And we're inviting you to prepare a script. It can be 30 seconds to up to 2.5 minutes. And it should not, because this should not be a representation of animals. I think you really stress that. You're not speaking for animals. We encourage you to speak from a position of I. You and your insights, what you take away from the conference. It can be a testimony, it can be a poem, it can be your vision for a post-abolitionist world. It can be in English and French. And this is also about an experience, your experience, what it feels like to raise your voice literally in a public space, like, well, in the street. So for some of us, this is really intimidating, but let's do it. We are here all together. We're here to empower one another. So we also have a megaphone we're really proud of. It's called the Thunder Power. So it'll make you, so give it a try it out, and you will be heard. And if you prefer not to use the megaphone, you don't have to. We can use the human microphone technique also. We're flexible. We're all good at thinking on our feet. We also have signs. We have a few visuals. If you're interested in holding those and show them to the public. They're images of animals, different animal realities and other animal realities. For example, the way they're being exploited in industry, as opposed to how they could live their lives. So there are different kinds of images. And then there are also images of animals that show their expressions, facial expressions, trying to illustrate animal subjectivity as best as we can. And I think that's it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So I'll leave you all with the panelists today. Maybe I'll just, you can come. I'll just show this very briefly.
All right, so we're going to get started with the first panel. Just a couple of... Non, c'est lui. J'ai besoin d'aide. Just a couple of quick notes for panelists throughout the day. The format is going to be a 20-minute talk followed by a 10-minute question period for each panelist in sequence. And if you are using slides for your presentation, maybe just to ensure there are no glitches, feel free to come down when the person before you is doing their questions and make sure everything's set up and working. And I'll be sitting over here with the cards to tell you it's time to wrap up. So the first panelist this morning is Dylan Hallingstad O'Brien, a student at Hamline University, here to present Arakawa's Alternative Compassion, Ginno Saji, Humane Farming, and the Indoctrination of Youth in the Absence of Critique. So please welcome Dylan.
Is my PowerPoint now on the computer?
Did you?
I emailed it.
You emailed it. Okay.
So just where should?
Christian?
I think right there.
It's right there?
Yeah. No.
This one?
Right there. Yeah.
Okay.
Christiane, viens aider pour l'ordi.
I think I can get it. I think. Huh. Weird. Do you know how to download it? My PowerPoint?
Of course. You don't have it in PDF?
My PowerPoint?
Yes?
Why would I have it in PDF?
Okay, no, it's alright. Usually I export it in PDF. Why is it working? Oh, you went, no, sorry. No,
there's kind of like a precedent in anime and manga studies to have like really bad titles for presentations and papers, so I wanted to make mine like really bad. But anyways, so on December 9th last year, this Bane race track and kind of like a farm market complex in Obihiroshi, Hokkaido, the northernmost state of Japan, uploaded an image to their Facebook, and it announces a Shin pizza menu, a new pizza menu at one of the restaurants in the complex, and it's cooked in a brick masonry oven, and as you can see, there's kind of some innovative toppings going on. So earlier that year, they had also held an open house, and they debuted a new mascot, an anthropomorphic, smiling Bane racehorse, Ricky, to kind of greet children and others that aren't enticed by the hard gambling and such that the racetrack offers. For those wondering what a Bane race looks like, it's big draft horses going over steep slopes. But neither of these things were really something that somebody at this farm market racetrack complex of Tokachimura came up with. In fact, both of them are from this narrative of Gen no Saji that starts in a comic book form in 2011. It's serialized in a weekly magazine. So here's the scene from Gen no Saji, the animated version, where they're making the pizza. Here is where the main characters encounter Ricky, the racehorse. So basically, Tokachimura takes this narrative of Gen no Saji and uses it to promote their business, taking this fictional narrative and transplanting it into reality. And they go on even later now to have, these are sauces for making pork over rice bowls, which ties into the narrative, as you'll see later. But basically, Tokachimura has entirely changed their business model at this point to where they have converted their own gift shop at the racetrack to not be their gift shop anymore, but it is a gift shop for the world of Gen no Saji, this comic book narrative. So this paper is going to briefly discuss the popularity that this Gen no Saji narrative you're seeing has enjoyed in order to frame the importance, and I'm going to try and provide a brief summary of it before I move to analysis. And I'm going to propose multiple things. A, that Gen no Saji is a product of current industry and state-sponsored narratives, and that B, while it broaches animal rights issues minimally, it may hold some limited potential for advancing ideas of animal welfare into public consciousness, especially for younger readers and viewers. So, the author of Gen no Saji, Hiromo Arakawa, has previously written a series called Hagane no Renkinjutsu Shi, which was released in the English markets as Full Metal Alchemist. In this series, it's important to understand where she's coming out of making this new series, Gen no Saji, that's about an agricultural high school and situations around it. Full Metal Alchemist is one of the most successful Japanese comic books and animated television shows ever. The books have sold, I believe, the estimate stands at above 61 million copies, which is astronomical. And just kind of to briefly touch on the paradigm she comes out of with Hagane no Renkinjutsu Shi, she writes in this style of shonen, or young boys comics, where she's very clearly marketing her comic to young boys. There's action scenes, it's a bildungsroman. However, she touches on disability. This doesn't really capture it, but one of the characters is missing an arm, and there's some whole stuff going on with disembodiment. But there's a lot of disability in Hagane no Renkinjutsu Shi. As you can see, this dog's even disabled. And there's some really powerful feminist scenes in Hagane no Renkinjutsu Shi where women are shown in very empowering roles. There's women shown using food ways to create empowerment, which is kind of emerging now in feminist scholarship. We also have women being seeing the role of housewife as an empowering role, and there's even a specific scene where women deliver a baby, and this is seen as very empowering. So, also in talking about Arakawa and where she's coming from, Arakawa herself grew up on a dairy farm in the northernmost region in the city of Tokachi, where very close to where the racetrack I showed, Tokachimura, is, and probably gave her some formative experience, I'd imagine. Her self-portraits of herself are also of a cow with glasses. So, Gen no Saji starts in 2011. Arakawa was kind of not having a main series after Hagane no Renkinjutsushi ended, and basically it's serialized in a weekly magazine, and this is kind of probably alien to people in this country and American. But basically, it's in a magazine of Japanese comics. You go to the store, you buy one each week for like under $10, and you get maybe 10 different series, and this is just one of them, and it's 20 pages each week. So right now, as it stands, Gen no Saji has about 12 million copies of books circulating in Japan alone. It's received high critical acclaim, and it's really important also that it has received numerous awards. It received the Manga Taisho Prize in 2012, which is a very prestigious prize for comics in Japan. And it has gone on also to receive an award from the government, the Japan Food Cultures Content Award, last year. And that comes from the Japanese Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fisheries. And it received another really important prize from the manga publisher Shogakukan in 2013. So, this is our main character, Yugo Hachiken, and basically Gen no Saji, which translates as Silver Spoon, attends Oezo Agricultural High School, and the manga is basically about the experiences he has there. So pretty much the entire narrative just follows him having new experiences in a rural setting, experiencing farm life. And basically he comes to this agricultural high school after going to a very rigorous college preparatory middle school and has an emotional breakdown, which is discussed in little details throughout. So he chooses this agricultural high school of Oezo because he wants something that's not academically intensive, which comes into play kind of later. So, to kind of outline the plot, it's the way that this type of manga is created, it's anchored within this slice of life subgenre. The way that this genre works is that there is no central conflict. There is not an enemy, there is not a singular struggle that needs to be done. Instead, it's divided into arcs. So, for instance, there's the school festival arc. And the way slice of life manga works is that any external conflict is then internalized by the characters and resolved within them internally. So instead of Hachiken and his friends needing to resolve like some problem with the school festival, what happens is he needs to resolve the fact that he overworks himself and crashes, and how that ties in to his mental state. So the other two main characters we have are the romantic interest, Ake Mikage, who's in the equestrian club with Yugo, the main character, and there's also the character of Ichiro Komaba, who's the ace pitcher for the baseball team. So, I had a little slide of the arcs. It's not really important to know the arcs, there's just different arcs. So, I want to, since the main focus of this is I kind of want to look comparatively at North American humane farming narratives and the one presented by Gen no Saji. I'm just going to move straight in to the killing of non-human animals for their flesh. So, in the first three arcs, we really kind of have this, because as you can imagine, he's never seen non-human animals being farmed up close until he gets to this. And really, we see kind of the main force of the discussion of killing non-human animals for their flesh in the first three arcs of this. So about, looking at my table, until about chapter 31, we really kind of see this. and then it pretty much disappears. Not really settled, but it pretty much disappears. A lot of the solutions that we see to working around ethical issues that are presented by the killing non-human animals is similar to what we see from welfarist animal rights groups. So like, I'm trying to think of ones off the top of my head, but I'm in Canada now, so people probably aren't familiar with just American ones. So the first instance that Hugo really encounters an ethical dilemma is when he discovers that eggs come from out the same hole as a chicken defecates out of, and this disgusts him, and he doesn't want to eat eggs until they're working late one night, and the only option for dinner is eggs over rice, and then he rediscovers how delicious eggs were, so of course it's now okay to eat eggs again. As you can see, kind of getting welfarist already, and I'm sure every vegan in the room knows the taste argument. So he works at the romantic interest. I'm going to see if I can find a picture of Mikage. This is Mikage, the romantic interest. He works at her farm over summer break and ends up encountering some more things. And her grandfather in particular tells him that he does in fact love the animals that he then kills, which makes it okay. He just loves them in a different way. The exact discussion is that he loves them with feelings of, I want you to grow up and be delicious, not I want you to grow up and be my friend, which makes it okay. And Hugo doesn't exactly buy this. He's kind of like, I'm really not okay with this. This is like a system of oppression. And it's really bizarre because for a brief moment, we really have our main character of Hugo, we really have him challenge the grandpa and say, like, look, this is a system of exploitation. But what's also really powerful about Gendo Saji is the way that we have Hugo react. He's the only person in the series that is not from a farm, that is at his high school. And he reacts in a way that is framed as innate to the human condition if you're coming to a farm for the first time, which is really powerful when you think about it, and it coincides with some other research that's been done on the way kids are indoctrinated into the killing and farming of non-human animals. And I think that's, pretty powerful. So Hugo is a really round character. Arakawa excels at that. If you've ever read Full Metal Alchemist, you know that. And a really big part of him is the fact that he's not really neurotypical. He openly struggles with anxiety and depression throughout the entire series, and we see numerous glimpses of him having emotional breakdowns, and it's really unusual, to be honest. And I want to situate it within the paradigm of anime and manga. So like, it's not the first time somebody's been portrayed as non-psychonormative in anime or manga, but it's not exactly a good one. Perfect Blue is a very famous anime movie from 1997, and as you can see, he doesn't exactly look super attractive. He's not really the greatest guy. He's this deluded stalker of a pop singer, and he's like trying to kill her, and it's really not good. A bit later on, in Jisenjo no Mao, we have this maniacal criminal that will stop at nothing. His dad actually looks like a gorilla, and he sleeps with his own sister. He has no morals. He takes pills. He's smoking. He's underage. He's drinking. So, needless to say, like, non-psychonormative individuals in anime and manga don't exactly get the best rep. And with Hugo, it's really powerful that not only is he challenging agriculture at times, but he's challenging attitudes towards mental health, psychonormativity in Japan, which I don't really have time to get into it in depth, but the acceptance of non-psychonormative individuals in Japan is not really the greatest right now. I'm going to kind of skip over this part about Aki. If anybody ever wants the full paper, just contact me. I'm more than happy to provide it to you. It articulates this way better than I'm doing right now. But Aki, basically, I kind of wanted to talk about her from a feminist standpoint. Aki serves as kind of a testing ground for Hugo, because the series is very much, as I said, it's about Hugo internalizing things. And she kind of serves as his testing ground for his improvements on himself. And so to a degree, Aki is never like a full subjective agent. She's just kind of being acted upon with him. There's particularly a scene where like he manages to save her by acting incredibly patriarchal and acting like marriage can somehow save her. And so, yeah. I'm not incredibly familiar with my slides, so you're gonna have to apologize. I'm gonna apologize if I jump. So, you know, Yugo's choices initially in the first 3 arcs are framed as him thinking of making a personal choice to abstain from this violence. And it's tough because throughout the series, we see Yugo portrayed as a very compassionate person, and over the series, it's shown as him getting more compassionate, except for animals, which he becomes more participant in their exploitation, including going to the slaughterhouse and participating at one point. So, in recent years, we've really had an influx of Western humane farming narratives. I don't know if anybody has seen this horrible documentary, American Meat. There's also the new series by Chipotle that's on Hulu. I want to, just say, like, Genno Saji is very different from Western humane farming narratives. There is a pastoral ideal in Hokkaido, much like America, Europe, but it's a different pastoral ideal. It's still very, though, happy farmer raises happy animals. They're treated well. So, I mean, basically, anybody familiar with humane farming narratives, like, the shtick, it's, we treat them well, we don't give them antibiotics, they're happy and they're free until we hang them upside down and slit their throats. And so, I mean, that's kind of the same narrative, though, that Genno Saji is promoting, is you have, it's really striking, in the anime version, you've got the happy opening theme song about falling in love and going to the beach, and you see these happy smiling pigs, and then you see a flash to when they feast on the dead bodies of these animals. And yeah, I want to jump, for time constraints, to specifically, there's a friendship that Hachiken has with Buddha-don, which means pork over rice bowl, which he names it that because they don't want him to name the pig something that he's going to grow attached to. And what happens with Buddha-don is he grows really close to this pig, and etc., and he goes away for the summer break arc, he's at Mikage's, and then he comes back, and Buddha-don's suddenly fat, and a regular-sized pig, basically. And he struggles with this cuteness and reconciling it, and there's this really interesting discussion of the utility of non-humans to humans that goes on, but basically he ends up still being friends with Buddha-don, but he discovers that Buddha-don's going to be slaughtered, and basically he really struggles with this, and then there's this really bizarre moment where he decides that the way that he's going to be okay with this is he's going to use his summer wages from working at Mikage's to buy the entire body of Buddha-don after it's slaughtered and make bacon with it, and this is going to make things okay. And this ties into the narrative and how it, similar to Western humane farming, there's this emphasis on rationalizing the consumption of non-human bodies. So it's like, for Chipotle, it's okay because we treat them well. For Genno Saji, it's okay because I treated them well. And you have this rationalization that's going on with humane farming globally. But also, it's really important that when he purchases the flesh of Buddha-don, we suddenly have the series move from it being not okay to it being okay as long as we do certain things. And basically after that, really just any discussion on vegetarianism, anything, just goes by the wayside. It's suddenly okay. So for time constraints, again, I'm going to skip over. I briefly mentioned the character. I'm not sure if I have an image of him, of Ichiro Komaba, but there's a character, the ace pitcher, and basically a way that Arakawa makes the exploitation of animals okay in the series is she has the star pitcher of the baseball team need to drop out of school because his family is so poor. And she basically portrays every farmer, even the Inaras who own the comically titled Giga Farm, as poor. Every farmer is poor, every farmer is oppressed, and this drives sympathy. Man, I'm really doing bad on time today. If people want to ask questions on specific things, I'm more than willing to. I haven't touched much on the influences in sponsoring, but as I mentioned briefly, the government and corporations have endorsed this narrative that's already selling millions of copies, and that's specifically targeted at kids. So that needs to be emphasized. And also, there's significant differences between the anime and the manga versions. The anime, it's to flashback to Buddha-dan quick. It's with Buddha-dan, in the manga, it's he comes back, he's troubled that Buddha-dan's about to be killed. In the anime, so this animated version and not the comic, what happens is he comes back and Buddha-dan's not the right weight, so he's going to fetch a low grade at the slaughterhouse. So Yugo's reaction is to fatten his friend up before he goes to slaughter, which takes on this entirely neoliberal mindset and is kind of disturbing. And there's a lot of other differences. And the version that's been licensed for American markets at this point is only the anime version. And I just want to quick end with, here's another image of Tokachimura, because now their gift shop is entirely Ginno Saji. You can see all of this is branded products at the racetrack that you can get. And so I want to end by saying there's other anime and manga that are out there about agricultural life. This is one of them, Norin, and it's not exactly great in any mindset. This is a scene in Norin at the agricultural high school where the crazed nymphomaniac teacher tries to feed sushi off her body to students, which... But basically, I bring this up because I want to say that we look at this paradigm of agricultural anime and manga, and nothing's representing agricultural life and farmed non-human bodies correctly. So does Ginno Saji perhaps, is it better? And does that mean, what does that mean if it is better? And also, it should be stated that Ginno Saji clearly does represent welfarist attitudes. It's saying that we have to treat animals decently. And what I personally struggle with is with in critical animal studies, we talk about a diversity of tactics. Does Ginno Saji fit in there somewhere? Or should we instead be talking about narratives where, animals are envisioned as the ALF? There's a book from Japan called From the New World, where the animals become terrorists and terrorize the humans and establish their own democracy. And so, with that, I'll open it up for questions.
Are there any questions for Dylan?
Hi, thank you for talk. I just was wondering if you could say a little bit about what's going on in terms of animal rights in Japan.
Yeah.
It's not really your talk, but I'm curious.
Animal rights in Japan. I don't want to speak with a ton of authority. I want to qualify that. Animal rights in Japan, I think it's a specific thing is Japan's probably more anti-fur than the U.S. There's a lot of furs demonstrations and stuff in pretty big districts of Shibuya and that. Also, there's a lot of activism around the dolphin kill and the whale killing. Contrary to what a lot of Western groups say, there's a lot of people in Japan that are actively opposed to it, but really what keeps it going is Western interests. Meat consumption is lower in Japan by a lot. It's about a third per person a year of what it is in the U.S. But animal rights in general, it's hard to say. I wish I had the quote off the top of my hand, but there's a really controversial comic artist in Japan that has a quote of I've been told that 80% of Americans are incredibly religious Christians that are anthropocentric. Is this true, or have I been misled? And so basically there is this attitude of we're less anthropocentric, and it's tacit acknowledgement of it, but where animal rights is, it's hard to say. It's veganism, I don't think is seen as, big yet, and a lot of vegetarians in Japan will still consume fish. because the words for meat and fish are different words. I don't know. I'd say like in terms of vegan promotion, it's a bit behind where some other places are perhaps, but in terms of recognition of other sentient life forms as important, it might be ahead of us. So, yeah.
Would you say that this is like a good step in the right direction? Do you think other artists would be influenced to make maybe another comic about it just kind of with like a different ending? Like
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the impact that her previous work, Hagane no Renkinjutsu, has had on anime and manga has been, I mean, huge. There's a huge fan community also in Japan for anime and manga. So the biggest comic book convention in the world is Comic-Con, which happens twice in Tokyo each year. And millions of people come to this. And basically, there's this doujinshi, or self-publishing culture, where fans will adapt the works. And a lot of times here we think of this as the adaptation of works into erotic works. So Full Metal Alchemist, Hagane no Renkinjutsu, for example, has been adapted into a ton of spin-off works that envision homosexual relationships between different characters that people liked, or romantic pairings between them. So, I mean, people have toyed with her works before. I haven't seen anything like that yet, but I think ultimately, you know, with any work too, I mean, you have purchasing power a lot more in anime and manga than other, perhaps more Western sort of art forms. Like with a Western TV show, if you don't like it, there's really no way to change it. With a Western comic book, there's really not a way to influence it with your purchasing power. With manga, each week when you buy the big book that has, you know, 10, 20 series in it, you actually get a reader survey card, and you get to fill out, did you like this, what didn't you like, and you rank the series, and this can actually affect whether series are cut or not. And it's, so readers have a lot of influence, and so theoretically if the characters did something that was really atypical for them in the narrative world, the series would be axed, and so forth. But I think it is affecting. I think as we move on, hopefully we're not going to see more portrayals of teachers feeding sushi off their body, and this bizarre kind of agricultural life that Norin has, and hopefully move towards a paradigm of more realistic farm portrayals. And I think this is signaling that because it's selling millions of copies. So.
Yeah, maybe one last question.
You mentioned Chipotle.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts of the group of Californians that they say that the direct action everywhere and they're doing the Chipotle campaign?
Yeah. You know, again, I mean, anybody familiar with some CAS literature is going to talk about diversity of tactics, and I certainly think diversity of tactics is important. Focusing on Chipotle, for example, I don't know how many, show of hands, who's familiar with Direct Action Everywhere and their campaign on Chipotle? Okay, Direct Action Everywhere has done some demos at different Chipotles where they have gone in and they have done die-ins in Chipotle restaurants. If anybody's familiar with a die-in, you basically pretend to be dead and lay on the floor. They've also just held signs and disrupted business. I certainly think in terms of framing a diversity of tactics, it's important that, I mean, they're doing good work. Targeting Chipotle specifically, I don't know. I mean, I think it's good that they're drawing specific attention to humane farming, because I think in animal advocacy, we've really hurt the non-human animals by creating this lie that is humane farming. And that was our own fault, because we focused on factory farming. We didn't say stop killing non-humans. We said stop factory farms. And I've met other people that have been involved in campaigns that are very radical people, and just by using the word humane farming and not, you know, specifically targeting all farmed non-human bodies, it hurts the cause. And so I think what Direct Action Everywhere is doing is valuable. I'd be cautious that with that, though, the pursuit should be to draw attention to humane farming in general, not just Chipotle. Chipotle is not the exception, right? Chipotle is the rule. And they need to draw attention to that. And instead of having signs that say Chipotle is, so-and-so, it needs to be humane farming is so-and-so. And so that would kind of be my reaction. And that's kind of what I worry about with Gen no Saji is you don't want this idea that humane farming or, so-and-so restaurant is the exception. It's the rule. So, yep.
All right. Well, in that case, thank you again, Dylan, for your presentation. And we'll move right on to our next presentation, which is by Christina Stevens. Christina Stevens is an MA candidate in English at Purdue University. Her current project examines the intersection of non-human animals and biopolitics within post-colonial literature. And our presentation today is entitled Biopolitical Animals.
Okay, so I just want to preface this by saying, so like in the humanities and in English, what we do at conferences is we get up here and we read our papers, and I know that that's not necessarily like always the most engaging model. So I just want to open it up and say that if you have any questions as I'm reading, feel free to raise your hand, interrupt me, and we can make it a little bit more interactive that way. Okay, so essentially I'm going to talk about animals and biopolitics, but through the lens of the animal shelter today. So I'd like to start off with a quote from Judith Butler from Frames of War. And she says, "Animality is a precondition of the human, and there is no human who is not a human animal." Where, if anywhere, do animals enter the political realm? Are they apolitical beings, rejected political beings, or perhaps the radical center of politics itself? Humans have distanced themselves from animals by, as Aristotle explained, situating ourselves as the rational animal. It's supposed that politics function only by and through humans as rational animals. The question of the non-human political animal may appear irrelevant at first, but it's clear animals are political insofar as politics continuously regulate their lives. From the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, the ASPCA, to factory farming, to pet-keeping legislation, the lives of animals are regulated through political systems in place to both protect and utilize their lives. This mode of politicization means animals are political insofar as their lives are exposed to political regulation, not as a result of any active political agency. They're not like literally voting bills into law here. However, is there another way to think of animals and politics that transcends the limited anthropocentric view of animals as passive beings subject to the will of political systems? The animal shelter and its construction open up the question of animals and politics for me. So I'd like to begin by unpacking the etymology of the word shelter. So originating as a roof of locked shields, the term didn't come to signify a temporary home for animals until 1971. The definition of the word shelter indicates varying degrees of protection. So the Oxford English Dictionary defines shelter as a structure affording protection from wind, rain, or sun, anything serving as a screen or a place of refuge from the weather, and something which affords a refuge from danger, attack, pursuit, or observation, a place of safety. Given this definition, it would appear reasonable for shelters to afford animals protection from dangerous conditions, such as natural disasters, abuse, and also death itself. However, shelters in the United States take in approximately 6 to 8 million animals per year, and of them, 3 to 4 million are euthanized. So how do these presupposed places of refuge come to kill millions of animals each year? How is it possible to reconcile the amount of killing that permeates them with this rhetoric of protection? Does killing somehow perversely equate protecting these animals? So one thing to consider is debate between no-kill and traditional animal shelters. To clarify, when I refer to traditional shelters, I'm referring to animal shelters that practice euthanasia routinely. In his book, Redemption, The Myth of Pet Overpopulation and the No-Kill Revolution in America, no-kill advocate Nathan Winograd writes, "Today, the greatest challenge in sheltering is between no-kill advocates working to ensure that healthy animals, animals with treatable medical conditions, and feral animals are no longer killed in shelters. But the move towards no-kill shelters has been a laborious one. Most in the United States still routinely practice euthanasia. There's ongoing debate regarding why euthanasia is so prevalent in shelters. Reasoning includes species overpopulation, whether or not animals are adoptable, and the overall health of the animals themselves. One topic in particular, adoptability, remains diffuse. There's no nationwide regulation that states precisely what defines adoptable or unadoptable. So this leaves the lives of these animals in the hands of individual shelters and the individual shelter employees. Winograd offers a scathing critique on adoptability, and he says, an animal can be adoptable at the beginning of the budget year when there is plenty of money in cages, but perhaps not at the end when resources may be in shorter supply. Moreover, using this model means a kitten with an upper respiratory infection would potentially be treatable in February when there's plenty of cage space, but not in August because of mating season, when numerous puppies and kittens enter the shelter. If the shelter chooses not to budget any money for medicine, this would potentially mean the community does not have any treatable animals. So it's all about money here, right? So the language of adoptability in terms of shelter animals is flimsy at best, as we can see. Simply put, what happens to a lot of these animals is determined through luck, resources, even aesthetics. So for example, like a Persian cat would have a better chance of surviving a shelter than a feral cat for sure, which would most likely be euthanized immediately in terms of the traditional shelter model. So the regulation of animal life and life as such in this way is wholly problematic. The shelter is responsible for deciding which lives are essentially livable and which are not, by deeming them adoptable or unadoptable. The shelter itself and the animals within it become engaged in a precarious dance, a politics in which the shelter has the right to kill those it views as unnecessary or disposable. The shelter animals themselves, as actual animals, come to embody the target of this particular form of politics. The regulation of biological life as such exemplifies what a number of theorists call biopolitics. Essentially, the animal shelter situates itself as a biopolitical system, and biopolitics manifests itself through the regulation of the animal's biological life, like the actual materiality of the animal. Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben in Homo Sacer, Sovereign Power and Bare Life, refers to a depoliticized version of biological life as bare life. So bare life is that which may be killed but not sacrificed. Basically, like can be killed with impunity. This starts to explain the rhetoric behind the millions of feral cats, presupposed dangerous canines, and other supposed unadoptable animals dumped in communal crematories each year. However, for Agamben, biopolitics is thought to deal exclusively with human life. I'm suggesting a furthering of biopolitical theory through animals, the idea that biopolitics doesn't only target humans, but rather targets the animal itself, and especially through the animal shelter. So I think the animal marks an absence in biopolitical theory. I'm suggesting the ways in which animals are considered or not considered, utilized or not utilized, kept alive or disposed of, should open up a discourse for the examination of biopolitical systems. So acceptance of the human as the political animal and animals as non-political others, pets, or beasts disregards them as an essential function of biopolitics. So I've listed the animal shelter as metonym for animals in biopolitics. Shelter animals, quite literally trapped within the system, come to enact the system themselves. They sort of like fuel it. So biopolitics has the task of assuring the care, control, and use of bare life. And this is how the shelter functions, through the regulation of animals as depoliticized biological life. Thus, we have a real-world example of biopolitics targeting and producing itself through animals. So with the animal as a fixed target of biopolitical systems, I'd like to examine the ways animals embody and participate in the system, and as a result become the necessary center. And we know that biopolitics also works through like dehumanizing human life, right? This is how genocide is often like argued for, or I know that Agamben also does a lot of work. Oh, sure, go ahead.
As far as like adoption goes,
Yeah.
do you think that there's enough resources for adoption, but there's not enough promotion for adoption?
So what do you mean by that?
Like, for example, there's a lot of animals that need to be adopted, but do you think that, like, more people need to be aware of this? And then that would mean that there's more animals that would be euthanized because there's not enough promotion of this option?
Sure. So basically, like shelters, they have more animals than they can actually take care of. So they euthanize the ones that are like supposedly like unadoptable or wouldn't go first. So this would be like older dogs, presupposed dangerous breeds, pit bulls, Dobermans, stuff like that, or feral cats, which is sort of like a digression on the failures to like domesticate the cat and like certain cats that just like resist that. And do we have an ethical responsibility since we tried to domesticate this species to then like take care of them, or like at the very least not like kill them in mass numbers. So yeah, I think that I'm an advocate of the no-kill shelter paradigm. And I know that it seems like maybe there aren't enough people to take care of these animals, but I think if more people are aware that they can foster animals, so like they could foster like older dogs or something like that, yeah, I think that could help too, just like volunteering as like a foster home. Yeah. Okay. So, the recent biopolitical turn is bracketed by a politics of life slid quickly into death. And we know this can happen, right? So biopolitics, it wants to like help people live better, right? But it ends up killing like those lives or like those people that they see as either presenting a danger to like the livable populace or perhaps like consider like disposable or unworthy of life. So, according to Michel Foucault, in the first volume of the History of Sexuality, biopolitics takes hold through the regulation of life. Foucault designates biopolitics as a system of politics in which methods of power and knowledge assumed responsibility for life processes and undertook to control and modify them. The sovereign seizure of life inevitably manifests itself through command over both the life and death of the people that it's getting at. So he explains, one might say that the ancient right to take life or let live was replaced by a power to foster life or disallow it to the point of death. Therefore, modern biopolitics no longer assumes responsibility over the methods in which humans live their lives, but now also enacts a paternalistic sadism, the decision over which lives are worth fostering and which are unworthy of consideration. So this categorization echoes racist rhetoric, genocidal impulses, and questions political omnipotence. Should political powers control the existence of life and the ways in which its subjects live? So I intentionally use the third person pronoun its as opposed to his in an effort to emphasize sovereign fluidity, the ways power disseminates, and to try and detangle Foucault's ambiguous biopolitical subject. So Foucault frames biopolitics through humans and only briefly mentions animals. However, the instance in which he does presents striking language for me. So he states, for millennia, man remained what he was for Aristotle, a living animal with the additional capacity for a political existence. He says modern man is an animal whose politics places his existence as a living being in question. So for Foucault, both ancient politics and modern politics begin with this anthropomorphized version of the animal. So we have the living animal and then just an animal. So it appears for him, like in his thinking, I don't know if this was intentional, if this was a slip, but it seems like the animal is fixed within his biopolitical thinking for him. And so I'd like to proceed as if like the animal is fixed within biopolitics, as if it is somehow like the center, like either like the animalization or in terms of shelter, animal shelters, we can extend this to factory farming too. Like animals are somehow necessary or somehow like are always the target of biopolitics. So the animal shelter with its surplus animal populations, prohibitions on reproduction, and sovereign regulation of life and death is a paradigmatic site of biopolitics. The construction of the shelter relies on several fundamental biopolitical components: bare life, the animals themselves, regulation of bare life and death. So this can be portrayed through like a relinquishing owner, a veterinarian administering euthanasia or the drugs. Even just like certain like regulations. I know a lot of apartment complexes say that you can't have dogs over like 50 pounds or something like that, or like you can't have German shepherds or pit bulls. They'll have a list of breeds that you can't have. So, and then the unwanted populations, those are the unadoptable animals themselves. And so the largest organization of shelters in the U.S., the Humane Society of the United States, declares the following. The Humane Society of the United States is committed to creating a safer, kinder world for cats, dogs, and other companion animals. We provide legislators, communities, shelters, and pet owners the tools and information they need to eliminate animal cruelty, end the tragedy of pet overpopulation, and provide safe and happy homes for companion animals and their people, in parentheses. Nowhere does the organization mention regulating the life and death of these animals. This critical omission disguises the result of shelter politics, the death of so-called unadoptable animals. So a language of sentimentality allows the precariousness of animal lives in the shelter to go unnoticed by a lot of Humane Society supporters, when the reality of many shelters is one where lives are regulated and biopolitics becomes a political framework upon which like the shelter is built. And now like I am an English student, so I'm going to talk a little bit about literature and how I read this in, have you guys read like J.M. Coetzee's novel Disgrace? Some of you, okay. So South African writer J.M. Coetzee's novel Disgrace illustrates the animal shelter's biopolitical performance. Coetzee's language and approach to both shelter animals and the shelter itself reinforces the connection between animals and biopolitics. The novel's protagonist, David Lurie, volunteers his time in a rural South African animal shelter. As with many shelters, when the decision to euthanize is made, he one at a time fetches the dogs out of the cage at the back and leads or carries them into the theater. So here Coetzee creates a subtle metaphor, turning the shelter, death, and its performance into a piece of theater. So within this theater, the mass killing that occurs has long been justified through the fallacy of excess populations and population control. So in Disgrace, Bev, she's another character, says the following of these dogs. The trouble is there are just too many of them. They don't understand it, of course, and we have no way of telling them. Too many by our standards, not theirs. They would just multiply and multiply if they had their way until they filled the earth. They don't think it's a bad thing to have lots of offspring. The more, the jollier. So the creation of what we can call these excess populations is a fundamental aspect of biopolitics survival as an institution. So in order to regulate the lives of the livable and exert biopower to its full capacity, we have to create these excess populations, right? We have to regulate them. We somehow have to get rid of them in order to have the livable populace survive. So without these excess populations, biopolitics would cease to function. There would be no way that it could sustain itself. So the sovereign would no longer need to regulate life because life as such would regulate itself. Every life would be livable in this sense. So biopower creates these excess populations by deeming them excessive and somehow disposable or somehow not worthy of life. And so Beth emphasizes this when she says, the dogs that are brought in suffer from distempers, from broken limbs, from infected bites, from mange, from neglect, benign or malign, from old age, from malnutrition, from intestinal parasites, but most of all from their own fertility. There are simply too many of them. So in this instance, Coetzee introduces the internal fallacy of biopolitics. Unlivable lives are not necessarily physically unlivable, meaning suffering from disease or ailment. They're simply a biological nuisance. So the existence of life becomes paradoxically the enemy of biopolitics, when in fact, life is what the system claims to protect at all costs. So biopolitics creates these excess populations that are literally sentenced to death as a means of other people or other animals' survival. It's a perverse life through death. So in order to more fully understand and appreciate the purpose behind the creation of these excess animal populations, I'd like to discuss post-colonial theorist Ranjana Khanna's article on disposability. And she examines the way civilizations create and dispose of bodies and the repercussions of doing so. So in terms of the animal, her theory on disposability provides a useful context for thinking about shelter populations. So she claims, there are three strands of thought that emerge from the term disposable: the throwaway object in production, the available income in reproduction, and the sovereign commandment over life, death, and sexual access. So the animal shelter incorporates all three components of disposability, or her reading of disposability. So there's the animals, the excess objects in production, the shelter as such, which is the framework for the entire thing, and the relinquishing owners, which are often those who really I'll get into this a little bit later, but it'll make more sense once I get towards the end. So when you bring a dog to an animal shelter, you're sort of giving it up, right? So it's important to note that within the shelter, these animals, these dogs, cats, rabbits, bunnies, guinea pigs, they don't exactly represent those in the wild, right? We don't really have wild dogs anymore. But so they're anthropomorphized. They're given names, they're given personalities. Often shelter employees will write up a little blurb about him, about a dog or something, I don't know. He really loves going on long walks or something like that. To make them seem more active and animated. And so without this anthropomorphism, the shelter would have a hard time adopting these animals out, right? Because you want to sell them, they want to bring in the income so they can continue to help animals. This is the rhetoric they operate under. But not all shelter animals are humanized or anthropomorphized equally or at all. A lot of them come to embody what Khanna would call these throwaway objects. So Khanna evokes the animal shelter in its creation of excess populations through a discussion on sovereign power. Could there be a sovereign decision to make someone live or let them die if they're deemed excessive at any point? So this is how the shelter functions. These excess animal populations are submitted to biopower once they're deemed excessive. So excessive in terms of shelter animals can imply many things. Maybe the animal has a behavioral problem, medical ailment, there's shelter overcrowding. And Coetzee gets at this when he writes, when people bring a dog in, they do not say straight out, I have brought you this dog to kill, but that is what is expected, that they will dispose of it, make it disappear, or dispatch it to oblivion. Animals are surrendered to shelters and disposed of because they are often a byproduct of the biopolitical creation of excess population. We see this most often, I would say, with feral cats. So they're these wild cats that are maybe bothering your dog or something. You call animal control, they bring them down to the shelter, and most likely they're euthanized immediately if it's a traditional shelter. So in this way, the shelter becomes a type of slaughterhouse, right? So animals deemed excessive on this flimsy basis enter the shelter, are killed, and their bodies are unceremoniously disposed of. Usually this is like communal crematories, something like that. So this is reminiscent of other animal slaughterhouses. However, the difference lies in their disposal. So in traditional slaughterhouses, the dead bodies serve what some would argue nutritional and monetary value. Within the animal shelter slaughterhouse, the bodies are wholly discarded. Their value in any sense of the word, sentient, aesthetic, economic, does not exist. So disposal isn't the only way animal bodies are biopoliticized. Biopower targets the animal through reproductive regulation, and we see this in shelters all the time. Foucault examines this aspect in depth in the first volume of The History of Sexuality. He states, broadly speaking, at the juncture of the body and the population, sex became a crucial target of a power organized around the management of life rather than the menace of death. If we can somehow control like who's reproducing, then we can control like the population and like keep those that we think are like worthy alive and kind of like let the other ones die out. So the animal shelter regulates reproduction through forced sterilization. Before these animals are allowed to escape their biopolitical trap, adopted out generally, they must first be sterilized. So this rhetoric works on a number of levels, but included or not limited to adoption restrictions. So often they won't let you adopt a dog or a cat unless it's sterilized. So like you would pay for that, they would pay for that, often they do. Adoption fees that include the cost of sterilization, the plea at the end of The Price is Right to please spare neuter your pets, and social criticism that couples itself with female dogs in heat and male dogs with enlarged testicles. Unlike human populations, where reproduction is controlled through both preventative measures, such as birth control, and responsive measures like abortion, the shelter operates under restriction of all reproductive possibilities. So unlike Foucault's assertion that sex is a target of biopower, the actual biology of the animal, its reproductive organs, become the target of biopower. And this furthers biopolitics' foothold over their lives. So I'd briefly like to turn from Foucault back to Agamben. So in his book, Homo Sacer, he talks about states of exception. And I would like to sort of frame the animal shelter as a state of exception. So the state of exception functions through a sovereign suspension of law, and it gives a sovereign ultimate control over the lives of its subjects. So Agamben claims, the state of exception is not the chaos that precedes order, but rather the situation that results from its suspension. In suspending all law, the sovereign grants himself a monopoly over life, can basically decide like which lives are livable, who lives and who dies, essentially. So the shelter functions through a suspension of law that disregards life and instead exerts itself through a biopolitical frame where animal life is often sentenced to death. So like when we think of animal shelters, we think, and I don't mean to like say like we in this room, I mean just like humans in general often think that they are these like sanctuaries, right? So we're like helping adopt out like dogs and cats, like we're saving their lives, but often this isn't what happens. They're dying like by the millions every year. This is a real problem that we need to think about and try and work through, like why is this happening? So Coetzee also portrays the animal shelter as a state of exception and disgrace. The dead dogs, the ones who have been abandoned, become symbols of life's precariousness. David laments, as for the dogs, he does not want to think about them. From Monday onward, the dogs released from life within the walls of the clinic will be tossed into the fire, unmarked and unwarned. Stripped of any right or to life or respectable death, the dogs are disposed of in unmarked bags and go unmourned by the body politic. They are somehow less than bare life. They are the embodiment of the living dead. So politics has worked diligently to position itself as a human construct. However, as I've talked about, biopolitics as a political system relies on animals as its target. It's this targeting of animals insists upon a rethinking of animals as non-political beings. Their lives are necessary for biopolitics to function, therefore they are definitely political in this respect. The shelter is a state of exception wherein life is reduced to biological existence, regulated through the body, and death becomes inevitable. Biopolitics helps expose the fallacy of the animal shelter, just as animal shelters expose the danger of biopolitics turned necropolitical. The shelter culminates in the giving up of the animal to death. This leads to the inevitable view of animals within the shelter as discarded bodies and waiting, as somehow like objects of necropolitics now. So biopolitics as a system attacks the animal, and as Coetzee writes, this is the only life there is, that which we share with animals. And that's it.
What your thoughts were on the scene where face is particularly attached to a particular dog and
Right.
doesn't save that dog's life. And we think, reading the novel, that he's going to, and then he doesn't. And what kind of moral message do you think that Garcia is trying to convey with that scene, if any?
I don't know. I think he would, and this is all subjective, right? Because we're all reading literature and we're interpreting it in different ways. But how I read that scene was he wanted to save the dog, right? And doesn't he put off bringing, or no, he doesn't. Bev asks him if he wants to wait until tomorrow to bring this dog that he's grown attached to. Yeah. And he's like, no, let's just do it now. Like, he goes and gets them, they administer the drugs, and he dies. So maybe he's trying to get at, like, how do we get out of this system? He knows the dogs come there to die. Like, if he saves them for one other day, like, what does that really do? You know what I mean?
And just this one.
Yeah, and it would just be this one dog. So, yeah, I think it's really getting into the conflict of how shelters function, particularly, like, how they function in rural South Africa. I'm not an expert on that, but I would assume there's a lot of, like, post-apartheid stuff that goes into that. So, yeah. Yeah.
How do you feel about sterilizing animals as like reduce the amount of
Yeah, I think this is sort of a slippery slope. So I used to do grant writing for a no-kill shelter back in Oregon, which is where I lived. I lived in Portland. And so they enacted this TNR, trap, neuter, return program for feral cats. So what they would do is they would trap them, like bring them in, sterilize them, and then like release them back into the wild. I mean, it's the city, but and then like release them back. So they wouldn't keep reproducing, so they wouldn't, I guess, have to be killed. Like, this sounds so perverse, right? And it really is like the human's failure to like domesticate the cat that like this is happening, right? So then do we have an ethical responsibility to somehow fix this problem? And like, how would we go about fixing that problem? So I do think that, yeah, like sterilizing these feral cats is much better than just killing them outright. Yeah, I'm conflicted on domestication, like pet keeping and stuff. I have a dog and a cat and I love them, but I just, yeah, I'm a little bit conflicted about pet keeping, so. Yeah.
Thanks. So I was just wondering about whether you have any hopes for, I guess, rehabilitating the political status of animals. And I have, for domesticated in particular, and I have a concrete suggestion that I wanted to bring up. So,
Sure.
So it sounds like the sort of biopolitical power that you're talking about is problematic in part because it's taking a bad form of responsibility for animals. So it's taking the ultimate kind of responsibility, and so their political agency is completely subsumed. So, and that's partly because of this, routine sterilization and slash euthanasia. What do you think about, and I don't know a whole lot about this, but have you heard about these mandatory cat licensing programs? So apparently one was introduced in Calgary, and cat licensing in particular, because as you say, cats are the ones who are most pervasively harmed in shelters.
Right.
And it seems, at least on the face of it, to potentially reintroduce a political status that would give them, I guess, well, if not more rights, possibilities for living well. Because apparently it drastically reduces numbers of animals in shelters.
Okay, so cat licensing, I'm not familiar with that, so how does that work?
Okay, so so anyone who had a cat would have to have it licensed like one does a dog right now.
Right.
And if that cat would ever get lost or abandoned, which happens a lot, that cat there would be funding that would go into people bringing that cat back to the owner.
Okay.
And it seems very simple, but apparently it would make a huge difference in shelter population.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm wondering if not that, if you had any other hopes for other strategies other than not killing. To make shelters better places for animals.
Yeah, so in terms of cat licensing, I could see how that would be effective, but also ineffective if you had somehow like abandoned your cat and you refuse to take it back. I don't know that they could force you to bring it back into your home. But also, yeah, I think supporting no-kill animal shelters is the best way to go here, right? yeah, and just being aware, like I wasn't aware of this until maybe like 6 or 7 years ago, sort of like the mass slaughter that's occurring within animal shelters, because it's not something you would really think about. And then I think back at shelters I had volunteered at, like when I was younger, like when I was in high school and stuff, and there was a separate building where they would bring the animals, the animal control brought in, and we weren't allowed to go into that building. And I mean, I conjecture that I think that's where they were probably like euthanizing all the feral cats and stuff, and they didn't want the volunteers to really see that. So yeah, support no-kill animal shelters, volunteer to be like a foster parent to these unadoptable animals if you can. And yeah, I don't know if I have like the solution, but yeah, just like little things like that.
Maybe one last question, I
Okay.
think. Rocky, you had it?
I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about, I guess, kind of the like difference in the two ways that the trajectory of an animal brought to a shelter goes, either, I guess, ending in like termination of life or return to captivity in the like companion animal state in a home, and how you see that playing out as a live.
You mean like how do they decide which is adoptable and which isn't?
Or I guess more from like a theoretical lens in terms of like animal agency. If
Yeah.
the status as like adoptable actually like increases agency for.
Sure. I don't know if it would be necessarily like animal agency or just like our interpretation of their personality or a personality that we would give to them. So like, I don't know, like a really happy-go-lucky little puppy or something like that. Like, is it actually like an agent in its future adoption? Sure. Like, I guess so. Yeah. Like he's coming in there and sort of like attaching himself to people and like he's very animated, but I think it's just so slippery. It's all based on our interpretation of it, right? And Winograd also talks about like how much money they have, like the shelter has, like how much funding. So yeah, I think potentially, I guess, would be my answer. Yeah.
I guess to clarify the question, sorry,
Yeah.
I trouble phrasing it. I guess do you see the adoption of an animal as like the ideal outcome in terms of that still being like a return to this power dynamic within a home? Versus
Yeah.
in the shelter?
I guess I would see that as like, yeah, the most positive outcome, at least within like the shelter context, right? Because if they're not adopted, there's usually a timeline. If they've been in the shelter for too long, they're most likely going to be euthanized or like somehow deemed like unadoptable, like nobody wants this dog. And this is all like super subjective, especially geographically, right? Like maybe, I don't know, like the population of a certain city wants like smaller dogs, or do you know what I mean? Like it's all just like so slippery and subjective. But yeah, I would say that would be the most positive outcome for like that dog or cat or rabbit or whatever to be adopted into a good home, as opposed to being killed. Yeah.
All right. Thank you again, Christina.
Yeah.
Now to introduce our final panelist for this morning. Nicholas Backman is a second-year law student at the Faculty of Law in McGill University. A lifelong Montrealer, he is a member of the Student Animal Legal Defense Fund here at McGill, and animal law is one of his great passions. His talk is called Rabideau versus City of Ravine, Cases in Animal Law.
So thanks very much. So today I wanted to give a survey of some of the relevant issues concerning animals in tort law, and I thought that the best way to do this would be through a practical application to give you an idea of how a situation would arise in which an animal guardian would go to the courts to claim damages for the loss of a pet. And there's specifically two issues that I want to present. One is the status of animals as property in the law, and the second is recovery for emotional distress based on loss of companionship and bystander recovery from the perspective of the animal guardian. So the case I'm going to present is called Rabideau versus the City of Racine, and it's a case from the state of Wisconsin that took place in 2001. And the question to start off is, well, why this case? And there's a couple of reasons. The first is that obviously it gives a very good, it's a comprehensive survey of the issues I wanted to talk about. But why not something Canadian? the answer is, well, there's a complete lack of Canadian animal law jurisprudence, to the point that there isn't any appellate court commentary to give precision and clarity to the state of the law. I think one of the reasons for this is because either animal guardians in Canada don't know if they have a cause of action, and a lot of disputes might be settled out of court, meaning that we wouldn't be able to see a transcript of how the judge would have decided the case. And another factor is that an American decision would likely be persuasive, if not binding, on a Canadian court. So first of all, off the top, does anyone have an idea, in terms of animal law, which society do you think would have adopted more progressive laws, Canada or the United States? Yeah, United States by far. And it's surprising because in many issues Canada is very progressive, but animal law, we're really lagging far behind. So the facts in the case of Rabideau. Jessica Rabideau was a 19-year-old woman, and she was driving home one day in her truck, and she had her dog Dakota with her. She pulls up in front of her house. Dakota gets out of the truck and crosses over to her neighbor's yard. And out in her neighbor's yard, her neighbor's dog is playing, and the two dogs start having an altercation. Now, her neighbor was a police officer in the city of Racine, which is, by the way, a very blue-collar area. It's one of the highest crime rates in the nation. So he obviously had to deal with that. So he comes out and he starts firing at Dakota, and he fires 3 shots because he felt that his dog was being aggressed. And Dakota was taken to the vet and later had to be put down as a result of these injuries. And when Jessica Rabideau learned that her dog had passed away from this incident, she was extremely distressed, and as a result of this traumatic incident suffered mental anguish. So she decided to turn around and sue for the loss of her pet. And her claims, the claims she brought in front of the court, were under 2 specific headings. And the first was intentional infliction of emotional distress, and the second was negligent infliction of emotional distress. These claims have to do with, without going into too many details, they have to do with bystander recovery. So when you witness an incident take place to a third person and you're extremely affected, you have a recourse through the courts. And the other heading which her counsel raised in its oral arguments, but it wasn't something that they pled, was the heading of loss of companionship or loss of consortium. Loss of consortium is an interesting tort because it originated, bizarrely, as a right flowing from marital relations. And it used to be considered a century ago that a husband had these rights to his certain services from his wife, including sexual relations, household, kind of day-to-day maintenance things. And the husband could actually bring action to the courts in really bizarre circumstances. So he could, let's say the husband had been, let's say the wife had an affair with another person, the husband could actually go to court and bring action for loss of consortium because the other person had deprived him of this right. Loss of consortium gradually developed throughout the years, and it began to encompass loss of companionship and loss of affection, and it began to really broaden in terms of who could make claims. So now it's considered that if you're a close family member, you can reclaim loss of companionship. So the court in Rabideau rejected both the claims for intentional infliction of emotional distress and negligent infliction of emotional distress. And there's a couple of reasons why that I'll be talking about today. The first is the traditional conception of pets as property at common law. Animals in the law are treated as chattel. So your animal is no different in the law than your sofa or your pencil. And this is something that has existed for centuries and centuries, and it's this really abhorrent vision that was based on norms of how animals were perceived centuries ago, and it has yet to be really modified despite a lot of opposition from scholars. And the reality is, well, if you can claim for in front of the courts for the loss of an animal, what would you recover? Because it's considered property, you would only be able to recover its fair market value. And fair market value is this calculation that takes into account essentially the price that you paid for your pet. So there's some sort of monetary evaluation of how much the pet is worth. And then any special kind of services or usefulness that the pet might have in addition. For example, let's say you have a racing horse. So that is one of the big issues. There's absolutely no room for emotional compensation under that calculation. And that gives rise to this bizarre circumstance where animal guardians are compensated for a loss that they do not suffer, which is the monetary kind of value of the economic value of their pet, and they are not compensated for the loss they do suffer, which is the tremendous loss of companionship and the loss of affection through the grieving process, right? And in the case of Rabideau, the court makes this really ridiculous statement because they say, well, we have a lot of discomfort with the cold characterization of animals as property at the law. However, we're not going to change it. So the court basically declines to really alter this traditional conception of pets as property. And the critical problem in Rabideau and in any kind of case where an animal guardian brings a claim for the loss of a pet is how can they justify awarding damages for emotional distress despite three things. The first is the traditional reluctance of the common law to compensate for these types of damages to secondary victims, regardless of the fact that the primary victim might be a person or property, right? Second is the intimate relationship requirement between the plaintiff and the victim. So there's certain classes of plaintiffs who can claim for the loss to a victim, as I'll explain through this. And the third issue, of course, is the property status of animals. So the common law traditionally awarding damages for emotional distress has been anathema to the common law. And the reason is there's a potential for fraudulent claims. So traditionally the court said, well, how can we really evaluate whether someone's suffering genuine mental distress? It's easier to quantify, a physical injury, but how can you assess whether someone's really suffering? Also, there's certain evidentiary problems, and there's the problem that's been raised, this idea of infinite liability for third-person harm. So in the case of a bystander witnessing an injury, let's say, so it's one thing if Jessica Rabideau is claiming to have witnessed something that caused her tremendous anguish, but imagine if there's 1 million people who witnessed that same event. Can those 1 million people come to court and have a valid claim against the defendant? I mean, at what point is liability going to be stopped? So there's certain ways in which this has been remedied in different jurisdictions. One is, as I like to call it, the danger zone requirement, which basically says that a plaintiff can only recover if they were really in an immediate risk of harm occurring to them. So you witness an injury taking place, and you suffer anguish, but it's not enough. You have to be in an actual zone of danger at the time. Another is the classes of relations, and there's other different policy concerns driving these limitations, and I think one of the ridiculous ones is illustrated in Rabideau. And the court says, I quote, "Humans have an affinity to bond with an infinite number of beings. Allowing claims for emotional distress after an injury to a dog would then create a precedent for allowing claims for birds and insects, and they list a huge number of different beings." I mean, this is really ridiculous formalistic logic. And I think that it goes without saying that first off, they're applying this inadequate and inappropriate conception of animals as property. But second, they're not assessing relationships by the quality of the relationship, but based on the type. So I think that's really problematic just in itself. The intimate relationship requirement between the plaintiff and the victim. In the United States, there was this case in the 1960s called Dillon versus Legg, and basically in that case they set out a test for bystander distress, and they said that, well, you can claim if you are closely related to the victim, and basically they set out categories of plaintiffs that were excluded from intimate relations, and they limited this in terms of who could claim to parents and siblings and possibly grandparents and children. So really, and also spouses, of course. So there's this kind of set of different relationships that are recognized by the law. And the bond between an animal guardian and their companion animal is not given the same recognition. Other notable categories of plaintiffs who are excluded from intimate relations include close friends and same-sex partners. So it's really kind of a traditional, very conservative view of intimate relations. I think that in modern times, going back to the property issue, we now tend to consider pets as something more than personal property. And these attitudes that are evolving have been even reflected in the courts, not necessarily in the outcomes of the decision, but what the judges are expressing, the same idea that, this isn't something we're comfortable with. Animals as property, it just isn't something that reflects the sentient nature of animals. And now we have animal cruelty laws and other legislation, for example, pet trusts, best interests of the pet in family law. So sometimes in custody disputes in the United States, they'll actually take into account where the animal is best suited, which partner the animal is best suited to live with. I think based on the time, I'm just going to address... right, so in Rabideau, one of the conclusions that the court came to is that it's not up for the courts to change the traditional conception of property, but it's up to the legislature. So that's certainly one view. Another is that, well, if close friends can't recover for these types of damages, then whether an animal guardian should be able to recover depends on how you view the bond between an animal guardian and the companion animal. So is it an animal, is it your friend? Or, as a lot of scholars have contended, is an animal more like your child? And studies have actually shown that most animal guardians consider their pet to be akin to a close family member. I want to just address the different arguments for what approach Canadian courts should take in the future. So if a case ever comes up, one would be the status quo approach in the United States, which I think is very inadequate and inappropriate based on just its refusal to accept animals as something more than property. Another option would be what's done in Quebec commonly, which is to have to maintain the property status of animals but award moral loss associated with the material damage. So in Quebec, there's no problem if your sofa is destroyed, you can actually claim damages from mental distress stemming from that. So there's no analogous policy consideration for that. Another option would be to give animals full personhood and legal standing so that they would be able to make claims in their own name. This is really the radical view. The fourth option would be to elevate animals as something more than property, so that animal guardians can claim for emotional distress damages with the civilian notion that anybody should make a claim, so that you wouldn't be precluded from claiming just because of the type of relation. And then the fifth option would be, no action by the courts, but action by the legislatures. So that's really what I have. Can we open up the floor to questions if there are any?
Absolutely. If it's all right in the interest of lunch, does 2 questions sound all right? And then there'll be more time at lunch to discuss. So.
Okay, it's terrific talk. And what I'm saying isn't a criticism, it's just a suggestion about an aspect that maybe you're not taking into consideration. You're focusing rightly on animals not being treated as property, or that's right. But you're also focusing on the law as if it was all about compensating the survivor.
Right.
And what I wanted to suggest is that the law need not just be compensatory awards, it can also be punitive and deterrent for doing these things, and that focuses on the perpetrator and not on the survivor.
Right, and a lot of scholars have contended that the current status of animals and what compensation is able to be obtained is not enough to deter in itself. So one of the ways in which perpetrators would be deterred is by having a system in which compensation would be awarded, basically. Another issue, I guess, is that there is compensation in terms of punitive damages, in terms of really outrageous conduct. I didn't talk about intentional infliction of emotional distress that much, but what it is essentially that, let's say somebody has really malicious or criminal conduct that hurts a third person. In that case, punitive damages could be awarded.
You're right, but it's in the same category. The one who's being hurt is the survivor.
Yeah.
And I'm saying punitive damages for the hurting of the victim, not the survivor.
Right. I think for it's kind of a fine line. It's hard to really for the law to do both.
That's so with humans.
Right. Is there another question perhaps? Yeah.
I'm just curious from a legal perspective, how would you reconcile extending personhood to an animal with ownership? Because if I bought a human and walk into my house, decided what he eats and when he goes to the bathroom, sometimes forgot, I would go to jail.
Right.
So how would I reconcile personhood to an animal with
So
ownership?
personhood is considered really the radical view for animal scholars. And in many ways, it's probably not that desirable an outcome. I think in terms of personhood, it comes with its benefits, but it also comes with a tremendous amount of cons basically on the flip side. So if you extend personhood to an animal, it's not just giving them more rights, but it would also perhaps make them criminally liable, right? There'd be tremendous issues like that. And there's a test set out for like according personhood based on like a degree of different things that you're able to assert. So different, basically they look at your ability to make decisions and your ability to kind of foresee things, right? So in terms of that, it's kind of a radical view, and I think that it would perhaps, as you say, have some deleterious consequences for everyone.
One last question.
I just want to say something in response to that. I think there's degrees of autonomy because you do get to decide those things for your children and people with limited, there are a lot of cases in human cases where you are making decisions for other people, so maybe there could be measures of autonomy where you are a caretaker but not necessarily in control of their actions.
Right. I think what's most commonly regarded as kind of the view I'm pushing, certainly, is that animals should be elevated to something in between persons and property. So a special category, just recognizing their specific nature, which would probably reflect most accurately the nature and how animals are, right?
Did you want to ask last question?
Yeah, well, on that last point, I disagree. But on the other hand, I really appreciate your work. This angle you choose to take is still very, very helpful regarding the fact that non-human animal identify humans that actually care about animals and want their justice and fight and work for their justice are treated second-class citizens,
right.
And are being discriminated against. So thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so that concludes this morning's speakers, which means it's time for lunch.
45 minutes.
Yes, 45 minutes. We'll be back here at 1. For those of you here last night, it's the same place we had the food this evening. For those of you who weren't, if you just go out the door here and turn to the right, the food will be right there. So see you at 1 o'clock.